good day, everyone. I'm Neil Rodrigues, Senior Director of Global Supply Chain Operations at the International Rescue Committee and Committed Supply Chain Humanitarian. On behalf of the World Humanitarian Forum and our distinguished panel today, I warmly welcome you all to this roundtable discussion on supply chain management in the humanitarian sector. In this year, which is a year like no other, it is very inspiring to be coming together for this inaugural event of World Humanitarian Forum, New York. Change is a constant in our humanitarian sector, and as we stand at the starting blocks of a new and critical decade, the sector faces an incredible opportunity to reshape itself to deliver even better and achieve our goals of sustainability in an inclusive manner. Partnerships, networking, collaboration, and bold ambitions are the need of these times. And it is for these reasons that the World Humanitarian Forum represents such a unique and valuable platform to enable these mechanisms. We are fortunate today to have an eclectic panel representing a wide breadth of expertise and perspectives in humanitarian supply chain management. The topic today is a broad one. However, our aim is to distill, synthesize, and discuss the key themes of how increased transparency, digitalization, localization, and collaboration will contribute to shaping the sustainable humanitarian supply chains of the future. We will begin the session with introductions of the panel, followed by each panelist then sharing their insights on the topic in turn. We will also try and cover any audience questions at the end. Please do send those in via the chat function in the event software. So moving on to the introduction to our panelists. Our first panelist today is Dr. Diego Vega. So I'll call upon him to introduce himself and say a few words about what he does.
Thank you, Neil. Good evening, everyone. Good afternoon for those who are in States. My name is Diego Vega. I'm a Deputy Director of the HUMLOG Institute in Hanken School of Economics in Finland. We are basically a research hub for practitioners and academics to discuss and share thoughts on humanitarian logistics related issues. For the past 12 years, we've been working in close collaboration with organizations, local and international governments and other research institutions to develop research and education projects. To keep it short, some of our current topics include the impact of COVID in global supply chains, a project funded by the European Union. We're studying MSF's response to COVID-19 in their current long-term operations. We provide training for the UNHCR, but we also have our own academic, of course, Royal Masters and PhD students. We developed the first ever Humanitarian Logistics massive online open course, and we are a proud partner of the World Humanitarian Forum. So it's a really real pleasure to be here sharing this panel with all of you, and well, let's make the best out of this.
Thank you, Diego. Next up, we have Marie Huel, who is the head of supply department at Solidarité International, and also is the chair of the Interagency Procurement Group. Over to you, Marie.
Thank you, Neil. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be part of this amazing panel this afternoon. I'm the global head of supply for Solidarité International, as mentioned by Neil. Solidarité is a French NGO implementing emergency operations in 18 countries. Also, as mentioned by Neil, I'm the coordinator of the Interagency Procurement Group. It's a procurement-focused group gathering 29 INGOs, committing 2 billion euros of procurement per year across 94 countries. So we felt as a group that gathering is gives us the opportunity to focus on procurement operation and to discuss, compare and share experience and address all together the challenges we're facing into procurement as part of our field operations. And the COVID-19 gave me the opportunity to add a string to my bow, as I've been the operational coordinator of the EU Humanitarian Air Bridge, which has been an unprecedented operation this year, involving a donor, ECHO, sponsors, the member states of the EU, and a coordination role managed by a joint effort of NGOs through the Humanitarian Logistics Network, a French acronym, RLH. It's a mechanism which has enabled to move high needed cargo towards the field for the continuous implementation of activities during the first wave of the COVID. Thank you, Neil.
Thanks, Marie. Next, we have Claire, who is the CEO of Solvoz. Claire, over to you.
So good morning or afternoon or evening, depending where you're located. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks, Neil, for the introduction and inviting us. So my name is Claire. I'm a longtime humanitarian. I'm a log and founder and CEO of Solvoz, which is a platform to enable responsible procurement in aid, and we will launch in October. For myself, I graduated in Humanitarian Assistance Master in Dublin. I spent quite a few years with Doctors Without Borders as well as with other organizations. And while I was in the Democratic Republic of Congo in 2010, I realized that we humanitarians should be more responsible how we're dealing with our data. And that moment I shifted from operations and logistics into data-driven technology in the humanitarian operations. And years later, I started a movement for responsible innovation in aid, and I'm currently chair of the Aid Enough Foundation, as well as the founder and CEO of Solvoz. I'll keep it short. Thanks.
Thanks, Claire. We'll move on to Bethan, Canterbury next, who is the Director of Strategy and Business Operations at React Disaster Response.
Thank you very much, and hello everybody. And I know business operations and strategy doesn't sound like it's anything to do with logistics. In a previous life, I was in the British Army in the Royal Logistic Corps for 28 years. And a key part of what we do here as a disaster response charity is that key part of last mile logistics in theatre. So we are an emergency response charity. We used to be called Team Rubicon UK, if anybody had previously heard of that. And we specialise in high tempo, complex and dynamic crises. And we deploy internationally and domestically. Up until fairly recently, domestically meant the UK is very lucky. It doesn't have many natural disasters. We have occasional flooding, but along with the rest of the world, we are obviously dealing with the fallout from COVID, and we have deployed in response to the UK support to that. I'm very happy to come back to that in questions and how we collaborated there. But internationally, our role is to deploy in the immediate aftermath of a natural disaster, earthquakes, cyclones, flooding, hurricanes, tsunamis, etc. And to get humanitarian need to those who are remote that others can't reach, hence the absolute last mile logistics. Our volunteers are our USP, 70% are ex-military and quite a high percentage from the blue light services as well. So we have people that have been stress tested in some quite complex and demanding situations, and they really deliver on the ground and are used to all that sort of thing. So that basically sums up React Disaster Response. Very pleased to be here.
Thanks, Bethan. Next on our panel is Dr. Campbell Bright, who is the Chief of Supply Chain Management at UNAMID.
Hi, and thanks for the opportunity to not only learn from my fellow panelists, but to also share my experiences with those of you attending the conference from around the world. As mentioned, I currently serve as the Chief or Director of Supply Chain at the UN Peacekeeping Mission in Darfur, Sudan. But my background is a bit varied. I've got 20 years in UN supply chain and program management experiences when I've worked with governments, donors, vendors, and other organizations to serve beneficiaries who are among the poorest of the poor, and often in areas where people are usually trying to do the best they can with what they have, whether that's training, materials, funds, or other resources. But before that, I had a robust first career in the private sector in both IT as well as supply chain and project management again. So I feel like I'm able to utilize my diverse background to understand the needs and improve efficiencies in my current public sector role, where resources are much more constrained and motivations and rewards are very different than in the private sector. And of course, each organization brings its own culture to bear as well. I assure you, public and private sector supply chains are very different, and I'm sure we'll get into that a bit today. But they're the same in that they each need to listen and understand clients and various stakeholders and incorporate change at ever-increasing rates, manage resources effectively, and improve themselves to survive and hopefully thrive. So thanks again for the opportunity to listen and to speak today.
Thank you, Dr. Campbell. Next up, we have Muhammad Azhar Khan, who is a humanitarian logistics expert. Over to you, Muhammad.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Neil. Unlike other panelists, I'm not affiliated with any organization, but I spent 18 years in field in different countries in Asia and Africa, including South Sudan and Yemen, Myanmar, Middle East, also in my own country, home country, Pakistan. I worked with Islamic Relief, Handicap International, ACF, and also my last assignment was with Oxfam International as a roving logistician, humanitarian logistic expert, where I also served Oxfam as a regional logistic coordinator. My expertise are in humanitarian supply chain, of course, and also project management. My interests are with localization, working with partners, technology in supply chain, and I'm here. I hope I will give some solid input to this session today, and see you in the questions. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Mohammed. And finally, we have Hans-Peter, who is the Director of International Programs at the UPS Foundation. Over to you, Hans-Peter.
Thanks, Neil. Appreciate it, and thanks for having me there. So I'm Hans-Peter Teufels, and I'm with the UPS Foundation, the philanthropic arm of UPS, being responsible for not only international programs, but as well humanitarian supply chains. Before I started working with the foundation 5 years ago, I was with the UPS in a number of different roles in human resources, in government relations, labor, and of course some operational responsibilities for about 30 years. So some background definitely in practice as well, but more on the commercial side. Within the foundation, we manage a portfolio of community investment programs designed to connect to our global logistics business. On one hand, the programs are executed through strategic partnerships with global nonprofits, NGOs, UN organizations, not to forget the Red Cross organization and Red Crescent organizations, and the engagement then of UPS employees with local communities around the world. We have 4 focus areas where we are dealing with employee volunteering, with diversity and inclusion, with environmental sustainability, and with community safety, where the work with the UN, IFRC, and the NGOs is located. We, as a leader in supply chain, logistics, and distribution, we have offered technical solutions and innovation since many years. And so some of the capabilities that we have used in the past, we are using right now, we believe that they should be as well part of the daily use within UN organizations and NGOs and INGOs, because data is everything. And I hope that we are having a lively and good discussion today to make sure that people are able to maybe learn as well a little bit from the innovation that we are having for the good of the industry on one end, but as well for the good of the humanitarian world. So looking forward to talk with you guys. Thanks again for having me.
Thank you, Hans-Peter. Okay, so that completes the round of introductions. And now I think we have quite a lot of new attendees who have joined as well. So as we get into the main body of discussion today, let me just take a moment to remind everyone of the themes that we will be discussing today. So these are increased transparency, digitalization, localization, and collaboration. How are they all going to contribute towards creating the sustainable humanitarian supply chains of the future? Big topic, but as you can see, we have quite an eclectic and very strong panel today with a broad range of experience from across the sector and from private sector donors and all corners of the sector really to provide their views and perspectives on this topic. So let's start off with asking Dr. Diego Vega to speak a bit and share his perspectives on how localization of supply chains being vital for increased sustainability. We are seeing some new reforms in the Red Cross and the Red Crescent societies and the UN for the training of local partners, trying to improve this. Could you outline how these reforms will contribute to improving supply chains going forward?
Sure, Neil. Thank you so much. Well, localization has been on the agenda for years, and we find it currently on the SDGs, on the Grand Bargain, and almost every strategy of every big, medium, and even small NGO to try to go local and respond with local resources. A lot of big efforts have been done by the humanitarian community and academics trying to push forth this idea of localization. And of course, using local resources, training local staff to respond to disasters or conflicts or any type of event. However, as you all know, as we all know, this context is extremely dynamic and the crises we've been living now are extremely complex. And of course, supply chains have been advancing and just moving forward a more technological and more advanced supply chains in a short way. So that shows the need of more and new learning from local partners that will be able to just basically match to that demand of advanced supply chains in complex emergencies. And of course, we have not been able to respond as fast as possible. The best example, I think we all agree on this, is the COVID-19. Many of international staff that were deployed in different parts of the world responding to specific events were called back. We had that in our institute. One of our team members was called back from the Philippines. And the last resource there was just local staff, local search staff, which in some cases that handover from international staff to local is not that easy. And of course, there might create some clashes. So we see that need and we're continuing seeing it through the COVID response that it's not enough. In the past panels on the keynote on leaving no one behind, in the panel of innovation, it came up as a normal topic about localization and how supply chains should be more local to help them respond faster. So in that sense, we've been seeing big calls from IFRC, from the UN to try to rethink their strategy and try to strength and develop more strength and enhance that capacity, local capacity to respond to supply chains. And of course, that comes in line with developing new curriculums, new trainings, new paths, new careers for local staff that want to get more knowledge, more competences, and of course, just give more support to those supply chains. So to respond to the question, what can that idea or that concept of localization bring to supply chains? I can think of three things. First, responsiveness. if we have local staff with the good knowledge and needed knowledge to respond, we don't need to wait for anyone to come for us and help to build those supply chains. If that knowledge exists, the supply chains can be built, and just we would need to wait for the items to arrive, just not wait to someone to build that supply chain. So that would provide that responsiveness. In line with that, localization, local capacity would bring scalability. There's a big call for surge capacity in terms of medical terms and surge staff. In supply chains, we call that scalability, the capacity of just scaling up and respond to an event and then just scale down. In many cases, we see micro emergencies in a way within a protracted crisis. Let's call it a cholera outbreak or even the COVID. Those are small emergencies that had to be added into a permanent supply chain, let's say responding to a famine or just supplying items for a camp. We need that capacity to scale up, and ideally it should be done by locals because they know how the context is and they know the needs. So why should we just bring something new out of it? And the third thing, which is linked to that, and it came again in one of the previous session, it's inclusiveness. And I think that's really, really important now, just not addressing the needs from this really, really far away perspective, but just let them, the beneficiaries and the local communities choose and adapt and understand how the things should be done and then deploy directly. So in terms of supply chains, and it's not because we are a research institute or an academic institute, we think it's about training, it's about sharing the knowledge that we can have as academics and as international organizations to local communities and just begin that discussion about what are the real needs on the field and how can we just bring whatever is needed in terms of competences and capabilities to develop that knowledge. A very good example, if you have the time, is the White Helmets, a very grassroots organization that has been supported by the Red Cross for almost 5 years. And it's the great example of how a local, very informal organization can be supported by something big and just make things happen. So, of course, and again, to the discussions on the previous panels, it's about the scope and the time that we're planning to. Is not about 5 years, it might 10, 15 years, but the idea is to keep doing it and just trying to push it forth so we can get that, hopefully, localization in every supply chain.
Thank you, Dr. Diego, for sharing those very thoughtful insights on the important topic of localization in particular. We will now move to discuss a little bit more around collaboration and how we can collaborate better as a sector. This has partly been triggered by the big event of this year, which is the pandemic. So I'm going to ask Marie to explain to us a bit more about the experiences that she has had during this year in particular. As we know, approximately 40% of yearly global air cargo, as per IATA statistics, is transported via passenger aircraft. And so when these PAX aircraft were grounded as the pandemic took hold of the world, tons of necessary cargo was just unable to reach its destination. However, the sector did respond. And now with the risk of a second wave fast approaching, how can NGOs, international organizations, private sector, and governments collaborate and innovate together to build more longer-term sustainable supply chains? Over to you, Marie.
Thank you, Neil. Thanks for this very interesting question. We in supply chain recently have been focusing a lot on sustainability as well as localization as strong drivers to reinforce the importance to have those both approaches. However, the COVID has significantly impacted this approach, where we ended up with sourcing everything out of China when we talk about PPEs, and we were facing something which was, if not predictable, at least not at this scale. So I just want to give, with these 5 minutes, a little bit of background on how this operation, the EU humanitarian air bridge, has been unprecedented. The EU air bridge has been running for 4 months. In 4 months, 30 flights, 12 countries reached, all L3 OCHA emergency has been covered, 800 tons of cargo moved, 400,000 cubic meters. So if not as massive as we could see the global movement on the Earth with the global world trade. However, it's been quite a lot of cargo to move to maintain the humanitarian operation through the world. How did we make it? Basically, the EU humanitarian air bridge originated from a global shutter of aerial operations. No flights, so impressive restriction of all countries to prevent arrival of passengers. So, as you mentioned, all PAX planes were grounded, and it prevented movement of passengers, but it was also preventing the movement of cargo. And maybe not the big ones, the smaller ones, because basically the one which were pushed into the passenger aircraft when there's a big loads where you can maintain streams. It was a smaller one which we needed to be brought on the field to cover the needs for our operations. So this situation has been quite exclusive and not seen in the past, or not in recent years at least, and it acted as a catalyst for joining efforts to move cargo. We, at some point, have been placing efforts in coordinating the needs. INGOs, like very simply, but quite exclusive as well, gathered their pipelines together in a single spreadsheet at first, where, okay, how much do I need to move? Where from, where to? Single, when would it be ready? With these caseloads, we ended up with very acute needs to cover the PPE needs at first, and then the global operation needs. Once we had these needs, we ended up in advocating towards a destination, allowing turnover of crews, entry of passengers, approving the landing permits, because basically we started with a cargo, but we ended up with a mixed solution where we were moving both packs and cargo, because it was a way to be most efficient. And we were in this way addressing both the movement on cargo, but also ensuring humanitarian access for the humanitarian workers that were implementing the activities to ensure continuity of activities in the most acute crisis. With both these efforts, the second effort was for the diplomatic channels. Basically, the EU delegation and the member states of the EU has managed to push the agenda with the destination to ensure all permits were given so that the cargo and people were able to enter the countries. So these both efforts at beginning and end point enabled us to show that INGOs, if you give them the means, they can coordinate and ensure continuity of activities. Why was it so innovative? Why? Well, basically we're moving cargo. It's not like rocket science and everything, but why was it so innovative? Basically, INGO usually have a very top-down relation with the donors because ECHO is a donor for INGOs, for most of them. On this specific project, it's been a full partnership, a very horizontal one, where you had the INGOs, the international organization, because the UN agencies have also pushed cargo through this way. And we also had ECHO as a donor and the governments. All together, they ensured the humanitarian access was maintained. Usually, it's really, really different. And this, being part of this mechanism, showed that in difficult times, where you have several obstacles, well, basically, collaboration can solve it. And when the diplomacy is involved, when a coordination in advance is managed, it can be overcome. So it's not an innovation in itself, because moving cargo is something we're usually doing. The way the private sector has been supporting ECO through provision of aircraft assets, the way NGOs have been engaged in coordinating their needs, the way the member states of the EU have managed to support the humanitarian access has been the innovation and the collaboration for the EU humanitarian average. Thank you.
Thanks, Marie. I think that was a fantastic example of collaboration, and there's definitely a lot of lessons that we can learn as a sector from that going forward. Switching over next to a very, very contemporary topic as well, which is this whole wave of digitalization that's sweeping the sector. I will ask Claire to share her views on this topic. So Claire, the question to you is, COVID-19 has highlighted the long-standing need for procurement in the aid sector to be as responsible and as efficient as possible. How can this be increasingly achieved going forward, utilizing the potential of technology and digitalization of supply chains as we adapt to these new realities?
Thank you, Neil. I think technology has opened so many possibilities. However, technology in itself will not be a golden bullet. I think definitely is the trigger that can enable improvements, but it's us that has to define these improvements and emphasize what is required to achieve. And we have to set the scene and overcome and cross organizational boundaries as well as politics. So we have to state our goal and things that we desire to improve, and those that can be enabled then by technology. And technology in itself will not solve anything. And I think COVID has shown in many respects the fragility of our supply chains. And it became obvious that we have to reevaluate those. And like many of those supply chains have been predominantly EU or US centric, with major hubs in the US or EU. And with this heavy reliance on cargo, example, on passenger planes, and these are disrupted, and then they are disrupting our supply chains. And for me, this is the same topic over and over again on this conference and many other conferences. It's a no-brainer that we finally have to stop talking, but give hands and feet to the call for more localization in supply chain as well. And this goes beyond staffing. It is various ways. So yes, the redesigning of the EU-US centric supply chains, but also we have to systematically include local suppliers and manufacturers of supply, as well as enable cash-based support as a strategy for localization. And as well that we have to share and allow ourselves to make use of information and knowledge systematically that goes beyond our organizational boundaries. And doing so not only sustainably, but also responsibly and transparently. Also, I think we have to increase the visibility of local solutions, and we have to shift away from thinking in a product that we have to supply, and therefore we push it through supply chains. If we don't think in solutions or in local solutions, you will never be able to incorporate smart or local solutions based on needs that we have to solve. And finally, I think we have to think in enabling environments with partnership instead of one organizational entity that goes all the way from the market scans up to supplying the last mile. And also, besides the impact on supply chains, we shouldn't overlook the indirect impacts, such as the disruptions we have in basic services and in general humanitarian aid provision. And an example close to my heart as a mother is the impact it has currently on maternal health. There is restrictions on traveling, on gatherings. There's unreliable practices in healthcare. There's a disruption in provision, and that threatens the life of millions, or at least thousands. And last month I came across a figure that took me that currently an estimated 30% raise in maternal death rates and in neonatal death rates from a study, I think, in India, Pakistan, and Indonesia. I can share the details. So even going back, if these health systems are picking up, they are adapting and they're changing due to this new reality. If our supply chains are still disrupted, we still can provide this quality maternal and child healthcare. So we should be ready when these new realities are emerging, and we should adopt to these new realities. And for me, the big plus or the big positive here is there's a wealth of knowledge. And in my opinion, humanitarians are characterized as very committed people to strengthen and enable responsible, sustainable supply chains. And I think we have a moral obligation to share this wealth of expertise and make use of connected and open systems as well as technology, therefore. So practically, for wrapping up, I think we have to dare to move away from agency-specific procedures, agency-specific kit compositions, our agency-specific vocabulary. Because if we stick with our agency vocabulary, it will complicate the interoperability of systems. So we should allow ourselves to use one another's information and knowledge and tap into this wealth of knowledge systematically in creating new ecosystems. And I think technology has never been more able and ready to do so, but we just have to commit to localization and overcome these institutional politics and reshape and show willingness into action. So I think that's the core. And yes, it's all about technology, but technology cannot do so unless we state those goals and the common goals and what we'd like to achieve. And whatever is needed can be built technologically, adjusted or adopted. But technology itself won't lead the way. Thanks.
Thanks, Claire. I think that was a very well summarized, huge topic that you covered over there, because you could go on talking about this one for a long time. But definitely interoperability is a big thing, and several good initiatives such as the Uniform Logistics Standards or the Universal Logistics Standards and several other data standardization initiatives that are going on, are some of the building blocks that are going to aid this mission towards all speaking the same language, as it were. But you also brought up another very, touched upon the localization in the last mile, which is a really important topic as well. So I'm going to ask Bethan next to unpack this a little bit for us. So Bethan, the question to you is, the disruptions of this pandemic to the traditional model of globalization has forced organizations to rethink their supply chain, especially with regards to the last mile operations. Could you share some insights on what we can learn from recent operational experience that your organization has had in the field to enhance the localization of humanitarian assistance?
I would be delighted, thank you. And an adaptable supply chain and localization is very much at the forefront of everything we do and react. So when we deploy, we don't deploy in big numbers. It's all about very small teams deploying into the aftermath of a natural disaster. So the very first thing that our guys have got to do is decide what of that existing infrastructure and supply chain still exists, first and foremost. So the principles are those that you would expect to be there. So the primary logistic hub of an airport or a seaport, does that still exist? Does it still function? The secondary hubs, the warehousing, is that still functional, or are we talking about putting up tents? Then the forward logistic hubs, the distribution points, that literally could be the back of a truck or a tent out in the field. So you have to assess what still exists. But it's not just about infrastructure. Localization is obviously about using people and the skills that are already there. Many of those involved in that local supply chain may have been victims themselves. So that's a key point when we're talking about training local communities. We found in Mozambique that a lot of the people were themselves cut off because the floods that followed the cyclone essentially changed the inland topography of the country. So you had whole communities now surrounded by water, and that supply chain had to adapt to try and get aid from one flooded area to another. And it's how do you adapt? And you either adapt by using a boat or you use a heli to leapfrog over those flooded areas. So it's all about adaptability and understanding what still exists from that national infrastructure. And also, to illustrate that further, in Indonesia in 2018, the earthquake and the subsequent tsunami, it sort of wiped out the airport. So the primary logistic hub became the seaport, but that was a long way to the south in the country, which then put in a massive road move into that supply chain. So again, you've got to build that into the supply chain. Then you've got to find your local vehicles and your local drivers. That's always a big surprise, what kind of fleet you might have available to you. Then you might find that your 30-ton trucks that you can actually get won't get the aid to where it needs to be. And we've got lovely stories of people with a 30-ton truck looking at a very rickety bridge and ringing up experts back in the UK, showing them a photograph and saying, do you reckon my 30-ton truck will go over that? So it's all about adaptability and a bit of bravery every now and again. But I think it's not just about vehicles. Sometimes the localization and the support can be much more basic. In Nepal, following the earthquake, it was actually, working with the Nepali Sherpas that even highlighted that there were communities that no one else could reach. And we worked alongside them, and literally they had teams going up and down that mountain for 10 days, 6-hour hike up the mountain, taking blankets and tarpaulins and rice until the roads were open again. So it's getting that situational awareness from the local population. It's working alongside them with the assets they've got and the local knowledge and the skills. All things that you would expect and can recognise. But I'd also say that being that vital part of being part of their own solution. So, great that you had those Nepali Sherpas that were delivering the aid to their own communities. So it's making sure that our little teams use the local population as that force multiplier and deliver local situations, and they save themselves. And I think I'd sort of round up on a point about do no harm as well. We saw in a very sort of small example in Mozambique, there was a family-run soap business that basically supplied the country. Aid floods in, and part of that aid was box after box after box of hand soap. Everybody thinking they were doing the right thing, but it completely decimated that business. So if you understand that better before you decide to flood the area with aid, you can actually stimulate the local economy and support it with less carbon cost and all the rest of it. So for us, we try and highlight areas that we know are susceptible to natural disasters, develop capacity building resilience projects with the community so we understand what their infrastructure looks like, what their local businesses look like, and we understand that better and have built those relationships for if the dreaded day comes. Tried to cram a lot in there, but I hope that covered some of the points.
Yes, thanks a lot, Bethan. Those insights from the front lines of operations are incredibly valuable. So thanks so much for sharing those with us. Now let's switch back a little bit, back to the topic of technology. And I'm going to call upon Dr. Campbell to give us some of her insights on this particular subject. So the question to you, Dr. Campbell, is a recent article published by the World Economic Forum outlined the benefits that technology can bring to supply chains, especially with how complex these supply chains have become in the modern age. But it also pointed out that new technologies can be quite overwhelming for leaders to figure out, as well as for users to implement and accept. So how best do you think these new technologies can be adapted to suit the individual needs for differing organizations, and particularly humanitarian organizations?
Thanks, Neil. Of course, the World Economic Forum is primarily focused on trade and the private sector. And as I mentioned in my introduction, humanitarian supply chains are really different than private sector supply chains because the number of stakeholders that you have collaborating, as Marie mentioned, And they each have a variety of motivations. So we've got governments, donors, beneficiaries, media, and even people with nefarious purposes involved. And in the public sector, we're often driven by funding and availability of supply, not by demand and profit margin. So resources are always limited in humanitarian, and we have to decide how to prioritize them. And I think the COVID example sort of gives non-humanitarian people a link into what we do on an everyday basis. And increasingly, we're looking at reverse supply chains, particularly e-waste, and relating to the Sustainable Development Goals, excuse me, and doing no harm, as Bethan mentioned. And then emergency response supply chains are even further different, where we have to keep the victim in mind, ease suffering, and save lives as soon as possible, and then have that moral imperative as humanitarians and as humans. But on the technology side, working in humanitarian world, solutions need to fit a range of users, from the geeks in the Silicon Valley or incubators across Africa to the phoneless displaced people and sort of everything in between. So on the ground, solutions have to work for unskilled and low bandwidth settings and candy bar phones. Networks crash, as mine did about 45 minutes ago. And of course, as Diego mentioned, they have to be scalable. What we find is many high-tech solutions come from projects and pilots, but they need scale and the resources behind it to go bigger and to become more in use. So lately, there's been a lot of talk, an increasing talk in the humanitarian sector about blockchain, where supply chain data is shared globally for ubiquitous information for decision-making. And it can be very useful to ensure that goods reach their intended beneficiaries in the humanitarian world. But of course, there are concerns about security and information sharing, and there's no industry standard yet, but hopefully that is coming. But blockchain is useful to look at transparency and how we can ensure that the maximum amount of humanitarian resources are reaching their intended beneficiaries. But sometimes there are unintended consequences of fully reaching those beneficiaries, as I mentioned, because of nefarious purposes involved. And the World Economic Forum has a fourth industrial revolution project, which has a toolkit related to blockchain, which is very handy, as you mentioned, their article. Internet of Things is another technology people are mentioning often, where chips or devices are placed particularly in high value items to track their supply chain movements and drive down waste while increasing the speed from order to payment. So with IoT, we can ensure goods, again, reach their intended beneficiaries, but it's resource intensive. And then how do we track to the last and the slowest mile, as Bethan was mentioning? Humanitarian supply chains have, as I mentioned, different drivers than the private sector. But one way that we can roll these out is to work with high value item manufacturers in public-private sector partnerships and piggyback off of private sector supply chains, such as high-value pharmaceuticals that are rife with fraud. Drones and 3D printing are technologies that are often mentioned as solutions for everything, it seems, in the supply chain world, and they are great solutions for certain things, but not everything. Drones, what we find is cooperation with government and regulations for flights and security concerns are paramount, along with flight safety. Drones are resource intensive and often related to projects, again, with narrow scope. But in disaster response and settings with very poor road networks and to assess the scale of calamities, drones are extremely effective. 3D printing in the humanitarian world, as in the developed world, 3D printing has some fantastic uses, and what springs to mind are limb sockets for amputees, which, particularly because I'm in a war-torn country, that is comes to mind easily. And then robotics, as we found in COVID, being able to have nimble manufacturing has become essential in the humanitarian world, as it is in fashion. And robotics can be used for production and production changeovers if possible, for instance, with PPE. And lastly, I'll close with big data. So in emergencies, data is often used for solution, but the real question is where there is no data transmitting, because that is where your real emergency is. And though it's not a new technology, we're finding increasingly that forecasting and models are being used more and more about pre-positioning and determining response networks that can be used in the case of humanitarian work and emergency response. Thanks.
Thanks, Dr. Campbell. That was a very great summary of all the exciting new technologies that are coming to supply chains. And it really represents a lot of potential and a lot of opportunities. But at the same time, there is a practical concern, particularly for the smaller NGOs. So I'm going to ask Mohammed next to, as a follow-up question on a lot of the technologies that you described, to speak about the costs involved in all these technologies, and how can smaller NGOs and local NGOs find ways to benefit from these new supply chain technologies without having to worry too much about the costs involved. And Mohammed, you could also touch upon how some of these technologies could be used to build more resilient supply chains as well.
Thank you, Neil. First of all, I will present some of the figures. In fact, I completed one qualification recently, and for that I conducted some survey, which is basically on the use of technology in different organizations. In surveys, around 100 people participated, most of them, almost all of them from humanitarian sector, and 69% related to supply chain, and the rest are from program and other support functions. So basically what I observed, and respondent said that 57% organization using old-fashioned standalone softwares to manage their supply chain, like procurement and warehousing and these kind of things. And 30% only they are using ERP for the supply chain management. And then 29% organization using distribution system, which are based on computer, like Red Rose or LMMS or this kind of, for the cash, food, and non-food items. But when we look at the advanced technologies, like Dr. Campbell mentioned, that like radio frequency identification, barcode or QR code or SKU code based inventory tracking systems, only 11% organizations, only 11% they responded that their organization is using. Emerging technologies, we see drones, only 3% people using, and 3% people, they mentioned that their organization is using blockchain, mainly for basically cash-based systems, 2% using artificial intelligence, and 10% basically they said that their organization are using advanced data analytics. So this is the state of technologies basically organization are using, which is, in my opinion, far behind the corporate sector. I agree that this is different from the humanitarian supply chain is different, and we have a lot of constraint. But what dilemma I observe in my experience, that any new initiative, including technology, or it requires a lot of energy for the humanitarian supply chain professional to convince the organization to adopt those things. Once they convince the organization, the bigger challenge they face is the cost. And total acquisition cost, which include the capital investment, capital cost, and operational cost, starting from the development of tools and then implementation, training, upgrading of their physical infrastructure, IT infrastructure, compatibility issues, and then later maintenance and technical support. It's huge cost for the small organization to cover from their regular budgets. And we also observed that
60 second time check, please.
Okay, sorry. Yes. So basically the solution for that, because they cannot cover from their regular budgets. And also if we see on the legislations, like we recently see the implementation of GDPR in European Union, many organizations, they struggle to have a compliance with that. So for me, the solution is the collaborative approach, where we see in the past that some of the collaborative project NGOs, they implemented like a parcel for the managing the partners And also currently Inspire Consortium, they are working on universal logistic system. We need same kind of initiative in the technology where organization collaboratively they develop the open source technologies which can be adopted by small organization where they are not, and also donors has to finance those initiatives. In terms of resilience, resilience is basically
Mohammed, I think we're going to have to cut that one short because we are running out of time to end the session.
Okay.
So, but thanks so much for sharing those those very interesting statistics on adoption of technologies. I think there's a lot that we can unpack from that in a separate forum possibly. And now I'll turn over to Hans Peter to talk to us about transparency. So Hans Peter, the question to you is, transparency in supply chains is becoming increasingly important in several sectors such as retail and commercial, with 73% of millennials, for example, willing to pay more for sustainable fashion and ethical brands in general, increasing their market share. The private sector clearly has a lot of experience in transparency of supply chains. What lessons can NGOs and the international organizations learn from the private sector in this regard as we work towards achieving the sustainable development goals this decade?
Thanks, Neil. Appreciate it. Excellent question. I think the big problem is that we probably should have another hour afterwards to really discuss the thing rather than now running into the next controversial point. But anyway, let me talk a little bit about transparency. I have a twofold answer on that. As my introduction possibly indicated, there is a sustainability portion and a transparency portion in the sense of visibility within supply chain. And to say it up front, it all costs money. There's no doubt about that. As for the sustainability part, every organization has to build a plan and first needs to assess what it can bring to the table. And the organization should start where it really can make the difference and bring something. We started working on being part of the solution about 10 years ago. 2016, established new sustainability goals to address the topics that are most important to the environment, to our workforce and the communities. The most ambitious goal there was to reduce emissions 12% in our global operations by 2025. This means that even as our business grows and the package volume increases, our emissions must decrease. And that relates to your question with people are willing to pay more for it because it will have a cost at some point, right? UPS sustainability strategy and goals are informed by the findings of our regular materiality assessments, our global enterprise strategy, and the stakeholder feedback. The approach starts with optimizing our own organization, and there are a couple of different opportunities and possibilities how to do it, from reducing carbon emissions to improving shipping strategies to be more efficient, teams looking on ways to reduce the impact on the environment and so forth. Just to give you a couple of examples, Orion is a groundbreaking route optimization technology, which we started to work on already many years ago, about more than 20 years ago. And we have been able to determine the most efficient routes for drivers to pick up and deliver, avoiding since then about 100 million miles and 10 million gallons of fuel each year, which translate into 100,000 tons of emissions. We have carbon neutral shipping. That's a customer solution, easy, low cost way that works through either our own capacity, which is fleet innovation, such as the rolling laboratory, where we have invested more than $1 billion a year in alternative fuel and advanced technology. We currently have more than 10,000 alternative fuel and advanced technology vehicles, and they enable us to develop, test, and deploy alternative fuels and to find out what is best and what operates best in the real world. We have more than 1 million cleaner miles each business days with those vehicles, just to say it shortly. Electrification is another opportunity. We of course know we have to help transform the markets and we need the infrastructure to help us reaching the greenhouse gas emission goals. In London, for instance, we partner with UK Power Networks and Cross River Partnerships on the Smart Electrical Urban Logistics project, representing the beginning of a transformation in sustainable urban delivery. In a sorting and delivery hub in Camden, we can charge more electric vehicles simultaneously than in any other UPS facility. And of course, we have a smart grid using central servers connecting to each electric vehicle charge port so that we are able to alternate. Fuel efficiency, the goal is to advance in the sense that 25% of the vehicles purchased to be alternative fuel or advanced technology by 2020. So we're getting there. So step by step. Drones were mentioned, don't want to dive into that. We have our own drone airline founded this year, UPS Flight Forward. We believe that UAVs can solve critical needs in humanitarian logistics and crisis response very effectively. We can reach people safely if they need medicine and life-saving supplies, and extend standard supply chains where probably only helicopters can go. And there's much more where we do not have the time for, but at the end of the day, what it means is you have to find a solution, you have to track your business, you have to go through and find ways to change things, and you have to be committed from the top to the bottom, and then go for it. And you have to measure it, and that's the point. You need to measure it, and for measuring you need data. And here I'm getting to the second part briefly. Transparency, in the sense of creating high visibility, is something that Industry 4.0 has in as well. Better products, higher quality, less waste of resources. And I think this is essential for customers. And I would assume this is as well highly relevant for NGOs and UN clients, being the most vulnerable part of the populations and the societies usually. So we believe in visibility through data management since decades, and have improved the way we are using data since then. And we therefore advocate for using aligned data system, allowing smart inventory management, connect order processes, track, trace, especially on the last mile. And there are, I have to say that, Campbell, there are solutions that can, where data capture can be done. And then probably you do not have real-time data, but you have it right after it. Probably a day later, and you still have the possibility to improve your management, your supply chain management, and your smart order processes that improves cost and quality. I wanted to go through an example in Uganda, but I see that time is of the essence, as I'm the last one in the row here. Seeing Neil getting a bit nervous here, so therefore,
go for it, Hans. We worked together with Global Fund and with Gavi before in the National Medical Store in conjunction with the Ministry of Health in Uganda, where the Global Fund provided bridge funding for a period January to June 2020 for a project, 3 pilot districts, in order to distribute vaccination. There was a vaccination aspect in there, and there was a cold chain distribution aspect in there. And the intervention that we undertook was expected to reduce stockouts, missed vaccination opportunities, strengthen and make efficient cold chain supply chain by consolidating all cold chain deliveries. That was successful through the established system, and we used supply chain management systems, tracking, tracing. And in addition to that, we supplied as well, our partner, I have to say, in Uganda, FIT, supplied gas for refrigerators, because that was one of the main problems there when we tracked down the problems for cold chain. So what we could achieve in the short period was 100% ordering automation, by 100% of the health facilities across the pilot districts. We had 3 days delivery lead time from 4 before. 100% facilities were reached through supportive supervision throughout the quarter to reduce heat and freeze alarms. So that is
that is impressive from our perspective. It's small, probably for those outside of supply chains. They don't really, it doesn't mean a lot, but for those who understand what a functioning supply chain, especially for vaccines, means, because at the end of the day, if the cold chain isn't working, you simply don't need to vaccinate anybody because the vaccination isn't working anymore, right? And that will have an impact for us in the next 12 to 18 months, because it will the time will force us to think even more about data capture and quality, as there are currently more than 200 candidates for vaccines in development, 24 human trials probably. Unclear of today is whether they will require ultra cold chain or less low temperature, and distribution will require attention because of potentially falsified vaccination, therapeutics, diversions need to be prevented, thefts, traceability need to be ensured within cold chain, especially as the cold chain equipment is not in the best conditions in countries subject to humanitarian intervention. And we work on that currently. We have to forward to discussions, share what we have prepared for effective response with potential COVID manufacturers. And this includes supply chain redesign, freezer farms extensions that we have, packaging solution, our last mile experience in some of those countries that are in question, the less developed ones. And we are ready to cooperate and currently work with Gavi and UNICEF in their efforts on COVAX. One major discussion point there, by the way, is the visibility within supply chain. And last but not least, we developed an own tracking solution with Google X that is RFID next generation, can be used, have different scopes and sizes, provides real-time visibility for any asset, and can be used as well outside of UPS supply chain services. Data and consequently collected and at the right point of time accurately and draw conclusions out of it will be crucial for us for the next months, private sector as well as humanitarian community. And whether the coronavirus or any future healthcare challenge, logistics will be at the center. And the key to all of that is creating transparency through data. So thank you for listening. And I hope I haven't spoken too fast, but it was at the sake of time. Thanks.
Thanks, Hans-Peter, for that. And with that, we come to the end of this session. We hope it has been an enlightening discussion for all of you, as much as we have enjoyed the opportunity to share our views and perspectives. Definitely 1 hour isn't enough to discuss humanitarian supply chain trends and the future. So, what we shall do, though, is at the World Humanitarian Forum, we will be looking to put on some webinars targeting some of these individual topics so that we can go into them in a lot more detail and have those longer conversations. And, we will try to do that until we can all meet together in person safely again. The decade ahead definitely looks set to be an intriguing and promising one, challenging ourselves and our ability to lead and adapt to the changing demands of our stakeholders here in the supply chain domain. So let's look forward to that future with a lot of optimism and confidence, and the knowledge that together all of us can make things better in the supply chain. Thank you, everyone, and have a nice rest of your day.
Thanks, Neil.
Thank you.
Thanks to the audience.
Thank you, Neil.
Bye.
Thank you, audience.